Some secrets aren't meant to be kept, they're meant to be found. When a drifting cowboy opens a forgotten diary on a train through Missouri, he expects to find an address, maybe a name. Instead, he discovers the desperate confessions of a woman running from a fate worse than loneliness, a life she never chose. Every page pulls him deeper into her world of fear, hope, and quiet rebellion. What he doesn't know yet is that finding her will cost him everything he thought he wanted, and saving her might destroy them both. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The summer heat pressed against the train windows like an unwelcome hand, turning the passenger car into a slow-moving oven. Caleb Turner sat with his hat pulled low, boots crossed at the ankle, watching the Missouri countryside blur past in shades of gold and green. He'd been riding trains like this one for the better part of 3 years, ever since the ranch in Wyoming had sold out from under him and his father's debts had scattered like dust in a hard wind. 32 years old, and he owned exactly what fit in the canvas pack wedged beneath his seat. 2 changes of clothes, a straight razor, a harmonica he couldn't play worth a damn, and the last $73 between him and sleeping rough. The money was supposed to get him to Kansas City, where a man named Porter supposedly needed experienced hands for a horse-breaking operation. Supposedly. Caleb had learned not to count on supposedly. The car was half empty. A mother and 2 children dozed near the front. An older gentleman in a wool suit read a newspaper despite the heat, his collar dark with sweat. A young couple whispered to each other by the window, their hands intertwined. Caleb looked away. There was something about other people's happiness that made his own solitude feel heavier. He was about to close his eyes when he noticed it. Tucked against the wall beneath the seat across from him, partially hidden by shadow, sat a small leather-bound book. Brown, worn at the corners, with a thin strap wrapped twice around its middle. Someone had left it behind. Caleb glanced around the car. The seat had been empty since St. Louis. Whoever owned the book was long gone. He should leave it. Should tell the conductor. Should mind his own damn business. But something about the way it sat there, small, abandoned, forgotten, bothered him more than it should. He'd lost things before, important things. He knew what it felt like to realize too late that something irreplaceable was gone. With a sigh that carried more resignation than curiosity, Caleb leaned forward and picked up the book. It was heavier than he expected. The leather was soft with age and handling, darkened along the edges where hands had gripped it hundreds of times. The strap was tied in a careful double knot. This wasn't some mass-produced journal from a dry goods store. This was personal. This mattered to someone. He turned it over, looking for a name, an address, anything that might identify the owner. Nothing. The conductor would be through in an hour. Caleb could hand it over then. Simple enough. He set the book on the seat beside him and returned his attention to the window. The train was slowing as it approached a water stop, a nothing little cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. A handful of passengers would get off, a handful more would get on, and the journey would continue, same as always. But his eyes kept drifting back to the book. Just find a name, he told himself. Open the first page, find out who it belongs to, and be done with it. His fingers moved before his conscience could stop them. The knot came undone easily. The cover fell open. And there, on the inside of the front cover, written in careful, elegant script, property of Eleanor Hayes. If found, please return to Hayes Residence, Lexington, Missouri. Reward offered. Beneath that, in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought, though if you're reading this, I'm likely far from Lexington and have no intention of returning. Caleb stared at the words. There was something defiant in that second line, something that suggested the reward wouldn't be collected because the woman who wrote it didn't want to be found, at least not by whoever might be offering that reward. He should close the book, should tie it back up and hand it to the conductor with the Lexington address. He turned the page. June 3rd, 1887. I am 23 years old, and I have never made a single decision about my own life. That sounds dramatic even as I write it, but it's true. Every choice has been made for me. Where I live, what I wear, whom I speak to, how I spend my days. Even this diary was a gift from Aunt Catherine, given with the instruction that I use it to record suitable thoughts for a young woman of good breeding. I suspect she imagined I would fill it with recipes and Bible verses and pleasant observations about the weather. Instead, I am using it to plan my escape. Caleb's thumb hovered over the edge of the page. This wasn't an address. This was a confession. He should stop reading. This wasn't meant for him, wasn't meant for anyone except the woman who'd written it. But her voice. Even in ink, even in words written weeks or months ago, there was something in her voice that held him. Intelligence, fear, a kind of quiet desperation that he recognized because he'd felt it himself. He read on. My father has decided that I will marry Mr. Thornton Groves. He announced this at dinner last Thursday, as if he were commenting on the quality of the roast. Mother smiled and said how fortunate I was. My sisters looked at me with what I think was pity, though it might have been relief that the decision had fallen on me instead of them. Mr. Groves is 47 years old. He has been married twice before. Both wives died in childbirth. He owns a dry goods business and a large house and sits on the church board. My father says he is well-positioned and respectable, and that I should be grateful for the match. I have spoken to Mr. Groves exactly 3 times. Each time he looked at me the way one might examine a horse before purchase, assessing value, checking for flaws. He has never asked me a single question about myself. Not one. I do not love him. I do not even like him. But no one has asked me how I feel. So I have decided not to ask permission. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd known men like Groves. Men who measured everything in terms of ownership and control, men who saw women and horses and land as things to be acquired and managed. He turned another page. June 10th. I have been corresponding with the Riverside School District in Jefferson City. They are in need of a teacher for the fall term. The position includes a small salary and boarding at the schoolhouse. It is not much, but it would be mine. I sent my application under my mother's maiden name, Eleanor Whitfield, along with references from Father Marcus, who has always been kind to me and does not know my father well enough to betray my confidence. The school board wrote back yesterday. They are interested. I have an interview scheduled for July 15th. I have exactly 5 weeks to gather the courage to leave. Caleb sat back against the seat, the diary resting open in his hands. This wasn't just some girl running away from home on a whim. This was a woman with a plan. A woman who'd thought through the details, who'd created a path for herself when none had been offered. The train lurched slightly as it came to a full stop. Outside, the water stop revealed itself to be even smaller than he'd thought. A single platform, a well, and a weathered building that might have been a station house or might have been someone's barn. 3 passengers stood waiting with their bags. Caleb looked down at the diary again. July 15th, that was weeks ago. Maybe more than a month, depending on when she'd written the entry, which meant Eleanor Hayes had either made it to her interview or something had stopped her. He turned to the next entry. June 18th, Mr. Groves came to dinner tonight. Father insisted I sit beside him. He told me about his business, about his plans to expand into St. Louis, about the type of household he expects to run. He used the word expects 14 times. I counted. When he left, he kissed my hand and told Father he was quite satisfied with the arrangement. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled and thanked him for a lovely evening. I am becoming very good at lying. The train whistle blew, sharp, impatient. New passengers climbed aboard, shuffling down the aisle with bags and bundles. Caleb barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the words in front of him. He knew he should stop, knew he was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But something about Eleanor Hayes's voice, about the careful way she documented her own quiet rebellion, made it impossible to close the book. June 25th. I have been saving money. Small amounts. Nothing that would be noticed. $1 here from the household budget. 50 cents there from the church collection I was supposed to deposit. I keep it hidden in the lining of my winter coat. I have $37. It is not enough, but it will have to be. I have also been practicing my signature as Eleanor Whitfield. I need it to look natural, unforced. If anyone questions my credentials, hesitation will give me away. I wonder if Mother suspects. She has been watching me more closely these past few days. Yesterday, she asked if I was feeling well. I told her I was merely excited about the upcoming wedding. Another lie. They come so easily now. Caleb's chest tightened. $37. That was barely enough for train fare and a week's worth of meals. She was planning to leave everything behind and start over with almost nothing. He'd done the same thing 3 years ago. He knew exactly how thin that margin was, how quickly things could fall apart when you were running on fumes and hope. He turned the page. And then, July 2nd. 2 weeks until the interview. 2 weeks until I either prove I can stand on my own or fall so completely that I will never recover. I am terrified, but I am more terrified of staying. Last night, I dreamed I was standing at the altar beside Mr. Groves. The church was full, everyone was smiling, and when the preacher asked if I took this man as my husband, I opened my mouth and no sound came out. I tried to scream, tried to say no, tried to run, but my body would not obey. I stood there, silent and still, while Mr. Groves placed a ring on my finger and the congregation applauded. I woke up with tears on my face. I cannot let that dream become my life. Caleb closed his eyes. He'd had dreams like that, dreams where he was trapped, powerless, watching his life slip away while he stood frozen. He'd woken up in cold sweats more times than he could count, swearing he'd never let himself feel that helpless again. And yet here he was, 3 years later, still drifting, still running from something he couldn't name. The train jolted forward, pulling away from the water stop. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks resumed, steady, relentless, pushing forward whether you were ready or not. Caleb looked out the window. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Hayes was either living the life she'd fought for or running from the one she'd tried to escape. And he was sitting on a train with her entire story in his hands. He should give the diary to the conductor, should let someone else handle it, should go to Kansas City and take that job, if it even existed, and leave Eleanor Hayes to her own fate. But he didn't. Instead, he turned to the next entry. Wow, July 10th. 5 days. I have my train ticket. I leave the morning of July 14th, 1 day before the interview. Father believes I am visiting Aunt Catherine in Columbia. Mother helped me pack. I have never lied to her so completely. I have never felt so much guilt and so much relief at the same time. I keep thinking about what will happen when they discover I am gone. Father will be furious. He will search for me, of course. He will contact the authorities, the church, anyone who might help him find his wayward daughter. He will say I have been deceived, led astray, stolen away by some unscrupulous influence. He will never believe I left because I chose to. Part of me wants to leave a letter explaining everything. But what would I say? How do I make them understand that I am not running from them? I am running toward myself? I do not think they would understand. I do not think they want to. Caleb's thumb traced the edge of the page. She'd left. That much was clear. The diary had been on this train, which meant Eleanor Hayes had been on this train, or one like it, which meant she'd gone through with it. But where was she now? He flipped forward, scanning the dates. July 14th, morning. I am on the train. I did it. I left a note on my pillow saying I would write soon. I kissed Mother's cheek while she slept. I walked out the front door with my bag and my savings and my fear, and I did not look back. The station was nearly empty. I purchased my ticket under the name Eleanor Whitfield. The clerk barely glanced at me. Now I am sitting by the window, watching Lexington disappear behind me, and I feel like I am shedding my own skin. I do not know what happens next, but at least it will be mine. Caleb read the entry twice. There was something in those last lines, at least it will be mine, that hit harder than it should have. He understood that feeling. The need to own your own choices, your own mistakes, your own victories, the need to stop living someone else's version of your life. He kept reading. July 15th, Jefferson City. The interview did not go as planned. I arrived early, dressed in my best traveling suit, rehearsing my answers. The school board was polite but reserved. 3 men, all older, all examining me as if I were some curious specimen. They asked about my experience. I told them I had tutored my younger sisters and assisted at Sunday school. They asked about my references. I provided Father Marcus's letter. They asked why I was seeking employment rather than marriage. I hesitated. I should have had an answer prepared. I should have anticipated the question. But the truth rose in my throat before I could stop it. Because I want something that belongs to me, I said. They stared at me. One of them, Mr. Calloway, the eldest, cleared his throat and said they would be in touch. I knew, even then, that I would not get the position. I left the building and sat on a bench outside the post office for an hour, trying not to cry. I have $41 left. I have no prospects. I have no plan. I am more free than I have ever been, and I have never been more terrified. Caleb's grip tightened on the diary. $41. No job. No plan. That was exactly the kind of situation where things went bad fast, where desperation made you take risks you shouldn't take, where the wrong person could offer the wrong kind of help, and everything unraveled. He flipped forward again, faster now, scanning for dates and locations. July 18th, Sedalia. I am working as a seamstress. The position is temporary. Mrs. Brennan made that clear. She needed help finishing an order of morning dresses and was willing to pay 20 cents a day plus room and board. It is not teaching. It is not what I wanted. But it is honest work, and it buys me time. I share a room above the shop with another girl, Mary, who is 16 and saving money to move to Chicago. She does not ask many questions. I am grateful for that. I have been writing letters to schools, to churches, to anyone who might need a teacher. So far, no responses. I try not to think about home. I try not to imagine Father's reaction when he realized I was not coming back. I try not to wonder if Mother is angry or heartbroken or relieved. Mostly, I try to believe that I did the right thing. Caleb exhaled slowly. She was surviving. Barely, but she was doing it, moving from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, still chasing that teaching position, still fighting. July 30th, Boonville. I have an interview next week. The Boonville School District is looking for a teacher for their primary students. The salary is modest, but it includes lodging and meals. I'm trying not to hope too much. Hope is dangerous when you have so little to spare. The train swayed around a curve. Caleb glanced up, realizing he'd been reading for nearly an hour. The landscape outside had changed, more trees, denser growth, the first hints of a town appearing in the distance. Kansas City was less than 2 hours away. He looked down at the diary. There were more entries, weeks worth, maybe months. Each one a piece of Eleanor Hayes's journey, each one bringing her closer to something, or farther from it. He should stop reading. He should close the book, tie it shut, and hand it over when the train reached Kansas City. But he couldn't, because somewhere in these pages was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. What happened to her? August 5th, Boonville. I did not get the position. The school board chose a man from St. Louis, older, more experienced, more appropriate for managing young children. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask what made him more appropriate than me. I wanted to demand answers. Instead, I thanked them for their time and left. I am running out of money. I am running out of options. I am running out of hope. Caleb's jaw clenched. He'd been there. That moment when the money was almost gone and the rejection started piling up, and every closed door felt like proof that you'd made a terrible mistake. He turned the page. August 12th. Marshall. I'm working at a boarding house. Cleaning rooms, washing linens, serving meals. The work is hard and the hours are long, but Mrs. Dalton is kind and does not ask questions. I have been here for a week. I do not know how much longer I can stay. Every day I think about going home. Every day I imagine walking through the front door and apologizing and accepting whatever life Father has planned for me. It would be so easy, so much easier than this. But then I remember Mr. Groves's hand on mine. I remember the weight of that ring he wanted to place on my finger. I remember how small I felt sitting beside him at dinner, and I know I cannot go back. I will not. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. She wasn't going to give up. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many doors closed in her face, she was going to keep fighting. And he was going to help her. The thought came so suddenly, so completely that it startled him. He didn't know this woman, didn't owe her anything, had his own problems, his own uncertain future waiting in Kansas City. But sitting there with her words in his hands, reading about her struggle to build something of her own, he couldn't shake the feeling that she mattered, that her fight mattered, that someone should be on her side. He turned to the next entry. August 20th, Marshall. I received a letter today from the Oak Ridge School District. They are a small community, 20 miles west of here, and they are in desperate need of a teacher. The previous instructor left unexpectedly, and the fall term begins in 3 weeks. They are offering $60 for the term, plus room at the schoolhouse. They want to interview me on August 25th. I've been reading the letter over and over, afraid I will discover it is a mistake, that they meant to send it to someone else. But my name is on the envelope. Eleanor Whitfield. This could be it. This could be everything I have been fighting for. Caleb's heart kicked up a beat. August 25th. He glanced at the date on the ticket stub tucked into his pocket. It was August 29th, 4 days ago. The interview had already happened. He flipped forward frantically, scanning the pages. On August 26th, Oak Ridge. I got the position. I cannot believe it. I have read the letter from the school board 3 times, and each time I am afraid the words will change. But they do not. I am a teacher. I start September 10th. They are preparing the schoolhouse for my arrival. I will have my own room, my own students, my own salary. I will have my own life. For the first time since I left Lexington, I feel like I made the right choice. For the first time, I feel like I am not just running away, I am running toward something. I am Eleanor Whitfield now, and Eleanor Whitfield is a teacher. Caleb smiled despite himself. She'd done it. Against all the odds, against every obstacle, she'd actually done it. But then his smile faded. If she'd gotten the job on August 26th, and today was August 29th, and the diary had been left on this train, something had gone wrong. He flipped to the last entry. August 28th. I'm leaving Oak Ridge. I wish I could say I'm leaving by choice, but that would be a lie. And I have promised myself that I will no longer lie, not even to this diary. Father found me. I do not know how. I have been so careful. I have used Mother's maiden name. I have avoided anyone from Lexington. I have kept to myself. But yesterday, Mr. Thornton Groves appeared at the boarding house. He did not come alone. He brought Father and a sheriff's deputy. They claimed I had stolen money from the family. They said I was not of sound mind and needed to be returned home for my own protection. It was all lies. But no one here knows me. No one here knows the truth. And when a well-dressed man and a sheriff's deputy say a young woman is unstable and needs to be returned to her family, people believe them. I tried to explain. I tried to show Mrs. Dalton the letters from the school board, tried to prove that I was here legally, that I had committed no crime. But she was frightened. She did not want trouble. Mr. Groves gave me a choice: return to Lexington willingly or be taken by force. I asked for 1 night to gather my things. He agreed. But I am not gathering my things. I am leaving. I have $47 left. I have 1 bag. I have a train ticket to Kansas City. I do not have a plan, but I will not go back. I will not. The entry ended there. Caleb stared at the final line. I will not. She'd left the diary behind, either intentionally or in her rush to leave. Either way, it had ended up on this train. And somewhere between Oak Ridge and Kansas City, Eleanor Hayes had vanished into a city of over 100,000 people, alone and running from men who would not stop looking for her. Caleb closed the diary carefully, his hands steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. He had a choice to make. He could hand the diary over to the conductor, could provide the Lexington address and let someone else deal with it, could go to Kansas City, take that job, and forget he'd ever read these words. Or he could do what every instinct in his body was telling him to do. He could find her. The train whistle blew again, long, mournful, announcing the approach to the next station. Caleb stood, tucking the diary carefully into his pack. Kansas City could wait. Eleanor Hayes couldn't. Kansas City sprawled before him like a living thing, all smoke and noise and movement. The train had pulled into Union Depot just after sunset, and Caleb had stepped onto the platform carrying his pack and a purpose that felt both crystal clear and completely insane. He had $73, no job waiting for him anymore, and a name that might not even be real. Eleanor Whitfield, or Eleanor Hayes, or whoever she'd decided to become in the 3 days since she'd fled Oak Ridge. The depot teemed with travelers, families hauling trunks, businessmen with leather cases, women in traveling suits stepping carefully around puddles left by an afternoon rain. Caleb moved through the crowd slowly, his eyes scanning faces out of habit. He didn't expect to see her. Kansas City was too big, too crowded. A person could disappear here without even trying. But she'd been on this train line. Maybe this very train, just days earlier. And she'd left the diary behind, which meant she'd been distracted or frightened or moving too fast to notice. That last entry haunted him. I do not have a plan. He knew what that felt like. Knew the particular terror of stepping into the unknown with nothing but determination and quickly dwindling resources. The difference was, nobody had been chasing him. Caleb made his way out of the depot and into the street. The evening air was thick and warm, carrying the smell of coal smoke and horses and fried food from a vendor's cart nearby. Gas lamps were beginning to glow along the main thoroughfare, casting yellow pools of light onto the cobblestones. He needed a place to start. The diary had mentioned a teaching position. That had been her goal all along. If she'd made it to Kansas City, she might still be trying to find that kind of work. Schools, churches, anywhere that might need an educated woman willing to work for modest pay. But she'd also been running, and people who were running didn't always have the luxury of being particular about employment. Caleb spotted a boarding house across the street, a 3-story building with a painted sign that read, Mrs. Kowalski's Rooms, clean and respectable. It was as good a place as any to start. He crossed the street, dodging a delivery wagon, and climbed the steps to the front door. The woman who answered his knock was somewhere in her 50s, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pinned severely back from her face. She looked him up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen every type of boarder the city had to offer. "Help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for a room," Caleb said, "and some information if you've got time." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Information costs extra." He almost smiled. "How much extra?" "Depends on the information." Caleb pulled out $2 and held them where she could see. "I'm looking for someone, a young woman who would have arrived in the city within the last few days. She might be looking for work as a teacher or a seamstress. She'd be traveling alone, probably nervous, probably keeping to herself." Mrs. Kowalski's expression didn't change. "That describes half the girls who come through Kansas City. You got a name?" "Eleanor Whitfield. Or maybe Eleanor Hayes." "Which is it?" "I'm not sure." The woman snorted. "You're not sure of her name, but you're willing to pay money to find her. That's either love or trouble, and neither one's my business." She plucked the $2 from his hand with surprising speed. "Haven't seen anyone by either name, but I'll keep my ears open. You want that room or not?" "I do." $2 a week, breakfast included. No drinking, no gambling, no women in the rooms. Break the rules and you're out on your ear." "Yes, ma'am." She stepped aside to let him in. "3rd floor, last door on the left. Washrooms at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Miss it, and you go hungry." Caleb paid for the week and climbed the stairs to his room. It was small but clean. A narrow bed, a bureau, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street below. He dropped his pack on the bed and stood at the window for a moment, watching the city move beneath him. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Hayes was doing exactly what he was doing, looking for a place to sleep, trying to figure out her next move, hoping the people who were hunting her wouldn't look this far. He pulled the diary from his pack and opened it again, reading through the entries he'd already memorized, looking for details he might have missed, anything that might tell him where she'd go, what she'd do, how she'd survive. One line jumped out at him. "I have been writing letters to schools, to churches, to anyone who might need a teacher. Churches." It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, Caleb was up before dawn. He skipped Mrs. Kowalski's breakfast and hit the streets as soon as there was enough light to see by. Kansas City had dozens of churches: Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Catholic. If Eleanor was looking for teaching work, she might have started with the church schools. His first stop was St. Mary's Catholic School, a brick building attached to a stone church in the older part of the city. A nun answered his knock, young, with a kind face and spectacles. "I'm sorry to bother you, sister," Caleb said, removing his hat. "I'm looking for someone. A young woman named Eleanor Whitfield. She might have inquired about teaching positions recently." The nun shook her head. "We haven't had any applicants in several months. Our current teacher is quite established. Would you mind if I left my name in case she does come by?" "Of course." She produced a small notebook and a pencil. "Your name?" "Caleb Turner. I'm staying at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house on 5th Street." The nun wrote it down carefully. "Is this young woman in some kind of trouble?" Caleb hesitated. "She might be. I'm trying to help." "I'll keep watch," the nun said quietly. "If she comes here, I'll let her know you're looking for her, but I'll leave it to her whether she wants to be found. That's all I can ask. Thank you, sister." He visited 4 more churches that day. None of them had seen Eleanor, but all of them promised to keep an eye out. By the time the sun was setting, Caleb's feet ached and his optimism was wearing thin. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. He stopped at a small cafe near the river and ordered coffee and a plate of stew. The place was nearly empty, just him and an older man reading a newspaper by the window. Caleb ate slowly, going over his options. Eleanor had been careful. She'd used a false name, avoided people from her hometown, kept moving. If she was still being that careful, she might not surface at all. She might take whatever work she could find under whatever name she chose, and he'd never find her, unless she made a mistake, or unless he got lucky. "You look like a man with problems." Caleb glanced up. The waitress was standing beside his table, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a coffee pot in her hand. "Just thinking," Caleb said. "Thinking that hard usually means woman trouble." She refilled his cup without asking. "Am I right?" "Something like that." She smiled faintly. "If you're looking for someone, you might try the employment agencies. Most girls who come to the city looking for work end up there eventually." Caleb straightened. "Employment agencies?" "Sure, there's 3 or 4 of them downtown. They place women in domestic positions, clerical work, that sort of thing. If your girl's looking for respectable work, that's where she'd go." It was the first real lead he'd had all day. "Thank you," Caleb said, dropping an extra coin on the table. The waitress pocketed it with a knowing look. "Good luck with your woman trouble, cowboy." The next morning, Caleb was waiting outside the Kansas City Employment Bureau when it opened. A prim woman in a high-collared blouse greeted him from behind a desk piled with papers and ledgers. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted it. "I'm looking for someone," Caleb said. "A young woman who might have registered here in the last few days. Name's Eleanor Whitfield." The woman's expression turned disapproving. "We don't give out information about our clients. Privacy is essential in our line of work." Caleb had expected this. He pulled out $5 and set it on the desk. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just need to know if she's been here." The woman looked at the money, then at Caleb. "Are you family?" "A friend." "Does she know you're looking for her?" "No." The woman pushed the money back across the desk. "Then I suggest you stop looking. Young women come to this city to escape all kinds of situations. If she wanted you to find her, she would have told you where she was going." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's in danger. There are men looking for her who don't have her best interests at heart." "And what makes you different?" The question hit harder than it should have. What did make him different? He was a stranger who'd read her private thoughts without permission, who was tracking her across the state based on nothing but a feeling that she needed help. "I have something that belongs to her," Caleb said quietly. "Something important. I just want to return it." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed and opened one of the ledgers. She ran her finger down a column of names. "We had an Eleanor Whitfield register 2 days ago," she said. "She listed teaching experience and clerical skills. We placed her in a temporary position as a shop assistant at Mitchell's Dry Goods on Main Street." Relief flooded through Caleb so suddenly he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. "She's there now?" "I assume so. She was scheduled to start yesterday." The woman closed the ledger. "If you do find her, Mr. Turner, I suggest you let her make her own choices about whether to trust you." "I will. Thank you." Mitchell's Dry Goods was a modest establishment wedged between a tailor's shop and a pharmacy. The front window displayed bolts of fabric, sewing notions, and ready-made shirts. A small bell chimed when Caleb pushed open the door. The shop was dim and cool, smelling of cotton and starch. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from buttons to bootlaces. Behind the counter stood a balding man in spectacles, measuring out ribbon for an elderly customer. Caleb waited until the transaction was finished, then approached. "Help you?" the man asked. "I'm looking for one of your employees, Eleanor Whitfield." The man's expression soured. "Miss Whitfield is no longer with us." Caleb's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "She worked exactly 1 day before running off without notice. Left me short-handed during the afternoon rush." He shook his head in disgust. "Young women today have no sense of responsibility." "Do you know where she went?" "If I knew that, I'd send her final wages to her and be done with it." As it is, she forfeited her pay by abandoning her position. Caleb fought to keep his voice level. "Did something happen? Did someone come looking for her?" The man paused, his irritation giving way to something more cautious. "As a matter of fact, yes. 2 men came in yesterday afternoon asking about her, well-dressed fellows. Said they were family and needed to speak with her urgently." "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that she was working here. They waited outside for about an hour, and when Miss Whitfield left for her lunch break, I never saw her again." He crossed his arms. "If you're another one of her relatives trying to track her down, you can tell the rest of your family that she's cost me a day's labor and I don't appreciate it." Caleb turned and left without another word. Outside, he stood on the sidewalk, his mind racing. Eleanor had been here, had worked here, and then Groves and her father, or someone working for them, had found her again. She'd run. Smart girl. But where? He walked the perimeter of the block, looking for anything that might tell him which direction she'd gone. There were dozens of shops, boarding houses, hotels. She could be anywhere. He spent the rest of the day checking every boarding house within walking distance of Mitchell's. Most of the landladies were suspicious of him. A few were outright hostile. None of them had seen Eleanor Whitfield. By evening, Caleb was back at Mrs. Kowalski's, sitting on his bed with the diary open in his lap. He read through the entries again, searching for something he'd missed, some detail that might tell him what she'd do next. "I have been writing letters, to schools, to churches, to anyone who might need a teacher." Letters. She'd sent letters before, carefully written applications under her assumed name, reaching out to places that might give her a chance. Maybe she'd do it again. Caleb closed the diary and headed back downstairs. He found Mrs. Kowalski in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with methodical efficiency. "Mrs. Kowalski, is there a post office nearby?" She didn't look up from her work. 3 blocks east. Why?" "Just need to send a letter." "You find your girl yet?" "Working on it." She snorted. "You've got the look of a man who's going to keep working on it until he either finds her or runs out of money." "Which will it be?" "Don't know yet." "Well, when you figure it out, let me know. I like to know which of my boarders is about to skip out on rent." Caleb almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The post office was a grand building with marble floors and brass fixtures. Caleb waited in line behind a woman mailing parcels and a businessman sending telegrams. When his turn came, he approached the clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers. "I need to send a letter," Caleb said, "but I don't have an address." The clerk blinked. "Sir, I can't send a letter without an address." "I know. I'm looking for someone who might have sent letters from this post office in the last few days. A young woman named Eleanor Whitfield." The clerk's expression turned wary. "We don't give out that kind of information." Caleb pulled out $3. "I'm not asking you to read her mail. I just need to know if she was here." The young man glanced around nervously, then pocketed the money. "What does she look like?" Caleb realized he didn't know. He'd read her words, knew her thoughts, understood her fears, but he had no idea what she looked like. "Young," he said. "Maybe early 20s. She'd be alone, probably anxious. She might have been asking about postage rates or buying stamps." The clerk thought for a moment. There was a girl like that yesterday. Sent 3 letters, paid in coins. Do you remember where she sent them? One was local. The other 2 were to towns west of here, Independence and Liberty, I think. More teaching applications. She was still fighting for that dream, even while running for her life. Did you see which direction she went when she left? The clerk shook his head. Sorry. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eleanor was still in Kansas City, or at least she had been yesterday, and she was still trying to build a life for herself. Caleb thanked the clerk and stepped back out into the evening air. Independence and Liberty. Both were within a day's travel of Kansas City. If Eleanor got a response from either of those schools, she might leave the city entirely. He needed to move faster. Over the next 3 days, Caleb covered more ground than he thought possible. He visited every school, every church, every employment agency, every boarding house he could find. He talked to shopkeepers and street vendors and anyone who might have seen a young woman matching Eleanor's vague description. Most people ignored him. A few tried to help. None of them had answers. His money was running low. He'd spent nearly $40 on his room, on meals he barely tasted, on bribes and favors and desperate gambits that led nowhere. He was down to $33, and Porter's job offer was long gone. On the 4th day, he got lucky. He was sitting in a small cafe near the train station, nursing a cup of coffee he couldn't afford, when a woman at the next table leaned over. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help overhearing you talking to the waitress earlier. You're looking for someone?" Caleb straightened. "Yes, ma'am. A young woman named Eleanor Whitfield." The woman nodded slowly. "I might know her, or someone like her anyway. There's a girl staying at the Riverside Hotel on 8th Street. Showed up a few days ago, keeps to herself, pays in cash. The desk clerk mentioned she seemed nervous, said she jumped every time someone walked through the lobby." Caleb's pulse quickened. "What's she look like?" "I haven't seen her myself, just heard about her from my cousin who works the front desk. But he said she was young, well-spoken, and looked like she was either running from something or toward something." That was Eleanor. It had to be. "Thank you," Caleb said, already standing. "Thank you so much." He left 2 coins on the table and headed for the door. The Riverside Hotel was a step up from Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house, but still modest, a respectable establishment for working women and traveling families. The lobby was clean and quiet, with worn but comfortable furniture and a front desk manned by a young man reading a dime novel. Caleb approached slowly, trying to appear casual. "Help you?" the clerk asked without looking up from his book. "I'm looking for someone. A guest here. Eleanor Whitfield." Now the clerk looked up, his eyes narrowed. "You're the 3rd person this week asking about Miss Whitfield." Caleb's chest tightened. "Who else was asking?" "2 men. Day before yesterday. They said they were her brothers." The clerk's tone suggested he hadn't believed them. "She left right after." "She's gone?" "Checked out that afternoon. Didn't say where she was going." Caleb felt the lead slip through his fingers like sand. "Did she leave anything behind? A forwarding address?" "Nothing." He stood there for a moment, frustration and exhaustion warring inside him. He'd been so close. "Look," the clerk said, his voice softer now. "I don't know what your business is with Miss Whitfield, and I don't care. But those 2 men who came looking for her, they didn't feel right. They had money and manners, but there was something cold about them, the kind of cold that comes with bad intentions." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "That's why I'm trying to find her first." The clerk studied him for a moment, then pulled a small piece of paper from beneath the desk. "She left this in her room. Might have fallen out of her bag. Might have been left on purpose. Either way, it's yours now." He handed the paper to Caleb. It was a receipt. From the Kansas City train station for a ticket to St. Louis, dated yesterday. Caleb looked up. "St. Louis?" The clerk shrugged. "That's all I've got." Caleb folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "Thank you." "Good luck, Cowboy. Whatever you're chasing, I hope it's worth it." Caleb walked out of the hotel and stood on the sidewalk, looking east toward where the train tracks cut through the city. St. Louis was a 2-day journey by train. It was a major city, bigger than Kansas City, with even more places to hide and even more dangers for a woman alone. But it was also where Eleanor was heading. He had $28 left, enough for a ticket and maybe a few days' expenses once he got there. He should give up. Should accept that Eleanor Hayes didn't want to be found, that she was managing on her own, that his help wasn't needed or wanted. But he couldn't shake the image of those two men showing up at the hotel. Couldn't forget the fear in Eleanor's written words. Couldn't ignore the feeling that if he stopped now, something terrible would happen. Caleb Turner had spent 3 years drifting. 3 years running from his own failures, his own losses, his own inability to hold on to anything that mattered. Maybe it was time to stop drifting. Maybe it was time to stand still long enough to actually help someone. He turned and headed back toward the train station, the diary heavy in his pack and purpose burning steady in his chest. Eleanor Hayes was in St. Louis, and Caleb Turner was going to find her. The train to St. Louis left at dawn, and Caleb was on it with $18 left to his name and a growing certainty that he was either doing the rightest thing he'd ever done or the most foolish. The journey took 36 hours, with stops in small towns that blurred together in his exhaustion. He didn't sleep much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those words from the diary. I do not have a plan. Every time the train slowed, he wondered if Eleanor had gotten off at one of these stops, if the St. Louis ticket had been a diversion, if he was chasing shadows while she slipped away in another direction entirely. But something told him he was right. Something in the pattern of her movements, the way she kept pushing toward bigger cities where she could disappear more easily, where opportunities might be greater even if the dangers were too. St. Louis rose up through the morning mist like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River, all brick and smoke and ambition. The depot was chaos, 3 times the size of Kansas City's, with platforms stretching in every direction and crowds that moved like currents in a river. Caleb stepped off the train into the noise and stood still for a moment, letting the reality of what he'd done settle over him. He was in a city where he knew no one, looking for a woman who didn't know he existed, with barely enough money to last a week. He shouldered his pack and started walking. The first 2 days were the hardest. Caleb moved through St. Louis like a man searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was on fire and the needle was actively trying not to be found. He checked boarding houses, employment agencies, churches, schools. He showed the diary to landladies and shop owners and asked if they'd seen a young woman matching Eleanor's description, which he still couldn't provide with any real detail. Brown hair or blonde? They'd ask. I don't know. Tall or short? I don't know. What does she look like? I don't know. Most of them looked at him like he was either drunk or insane. A few were kind enough to make suggestions. None of them had answers. His money dwindled to $12, then $8. He took a room in a boarding house so cheap the bedbugs had bedbugs, ate 1 meal a day, and walked until his boots wore through at the heel. On the 3rd day, he found a cobbler's shop tucked between a bakery and a tobacco store. The proprietor was an older German man with hands gnarled by decades of leather work. Fix your boots? The man asked, eyeing Caleb's worn soles. Can't afford it right now, Caleb admitted, but I'm looking for someone. A young woman who might need work. She's educated, good with numbers and letters, might be looking for teaching work or clerical positions. The cobbler grunted. A lot of educated women in this city. Most of them end up sewing or washing dishes. This one's different. She's running from something. She'd be careful, nervous, probably using a false name. The old man's eyes sharpened. False name, you say? Eleanor Whitfield, or Eleanor Hayes. The cobbler set down the boot he'd been examining. There's a girl working at the printer's shop 2 blocks north, came in last week looking for work. Said her name was Ellen White. Close enough to what you're saying that it might be the same person. Caleb's heart kicked. Which printer? Morrison and Sons, big place on the corner. Can't miss it. Caleb was already moving toward the door. Thank you. Hey, the cobbler called after him. You find her, you tell her Otto says she should stop running. Running just makes the thing chasing you run faster. Morrison and Sons occupied a large building that smelled of ink and machine oil. The main floor was a forest of printing presses, all clattering and hissing with industrial rhythm. Workers moved between them like dancers who'd memorized the steps, feeding paper, adjusting plates, hauling finished products toward the loading dock. Caleb found the foreman, a barrel-chested man with ink stains up to his elbows. Help you, the man shouted over the noise. I'm looking for someone who works here. Ellen White. The foreman's expression darkened. She in trouble? No, I just need to speak with her. You family? Friend. The foreman studied him with the kind of careful assessment that suggested he'd been lied to before and didn't appreciate it. She's upstairs, typesetting room, but you cause any problems and I'll throw you out myself. Understood. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading to a quieter space filled with rows of type cases and composing sticks. 3 workers sat at long tables, their fingers moving with practiced speed as they assembled words letter by letter. And there, at the far end of the room, sat Eleanor Hayes. Caleb recognized her instantly, though he couldn't have said how. Maybe it was the way she held herself, back straight, shoulders tense, as if she were ready to bolt at the slightest disturbance. Maybe it was the careful precision with which she worked, the same meticulousness that had filled every page of her diary. Maybe it was just that he'd been carrying her words for so long that seeing her felt like meeting someone he'd known his entire life. She was younger than he'd imagined. Couldn't be more than 23 or 24, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that would have been pretty if it weren't so drawn with exhaustion and worry. She wore a simple gray dress with ink stains on the cuffs, and her hands moved steadily through the type cases, even though her eyes kept flicking toward the window as if checking for threats. Caleb approached slowly, careful not to startle her. She must have sensed him anyway, because she looked up when he was still 10 feet away. Her eyes went wide, then immediately suspicious. "Can I help you?" Her voice was quiet but firm, with an accent that marked her as educated, probably from a family with means. "Miss Whitfield?" The color drained from her face. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't know anyone by that name." "Please," Caleb said, keeping his voice low. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to talk to you." "I don't know you." She took a step back, her hand reaching for something on the table, a metal ruler that could serve as a weapon if needed. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I found something that belongs to you, and I've been trying to return it." "I don't know what you're talking about." Caleb slowly reached into his pack and pulled out the diary. He held it up where she could see it. Eleanor's face went white as paper. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You left it on a train 3 weeks ago." She stared at the diary, then at him, her expression cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been fury. "You read it." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Caleb said. There was no point in lying. "You had no right." "I know." "Those were private thoughts." "My private thoughts." "I know." "Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you read it? Why did you follow me? What do you want?" The other typesetters were watching now, their work forgotten. Caleb could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of this conversation becoming public in a way that made everything worse. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked. "No." Eleanor's grip tightened on the ruler. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." Caleb took a breath. "Your father and Thornton Groves are looking for you. They've been following your trail through Kansas City. They probably know you're in St. Louis by now." The ruler clattered onto the table. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. "How do you know about Thornton?" "It's in the diary. Everything's in the diary." Caleb took a careful step closer. "Look, I'm not here to drag you back to Lexington or turn you over to anyone. I just thought you should know they're close, and I thought you might want this back." He held out the diary. Eleanor didn't take it. She just stood there, trembling, her eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "You read my diary," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "You read about my fear, my shame, my desperate attempts to build something for myself. And then you tracked me across 2 states like I'm some kind of criminal. It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" She was crying now, angry tears that spilled down her cheeks. "What gives you the right to invade my privacy, to follow me, to stand here like you know me, when you're nothing but a stranger who violated my trust?" "I didn't know you," Caleb said quietly. "That's true. But I know what it's like to run. I know what it's like to have no plan and no money and nowhere safe to go. And I know what it's like to need help and have nobody offer it. I don't need your help." "Maybe not. but I'm offering it anyway. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing ink across her cheek. Why? What do you want from me? Nothing, Caleb said. I want nothing from you except to know that you're safe. I don't believe you. Men don't do things for nothing. This one does, she laughed bitterly. You expect me to trust you? A man who's been following me, who's read my most private thoughts, who shows up at my workplace and disrupts my life? No, Caleb said. I don't expect you to trust me at all. That seemed to catch her off guard. She blinked, her anger faltering. I read your diary, Caleb continued. I shouldn't have, but I did. And what I read was the story of a woman who's brave and smart and determined to make her own choices. A woman who deserves better than to be hunted down and forced into a life she doesn't want. He set the diary on the table between them. So here, take it. I'm done carrying it. I'm done following you. But before I go, I need you to know that Groves and your father are close, and they're not going to stop looking. Eleanor stared at the diary. Her hand reached out, hesitated, then pulled back. How close? I don't know, but they found you in Kansas City. They'll find you here too, if you're not careful. I've been careful. I found you. She flinched. Caleb softened his voice. Look, you don't owe me anything, but if you need help, if you need someone to watch your back, or just someone to talk to who isn't trying to control your life, I'll be at the River Street boarding house for the next 2 days. After that, I'm out of money, and I'll have to move on. But until then, the offer stands. He turned to leave. Wait. Caleb stopped. Eleanor picked up the diary, holding it against her chest like a shield. What's your name? Caleb Turner. Why did you really come here, Mr. Turner? And don't say it's because you wanted to return my diary. Nobody spends their last dollar chasing a stranger across half the country just to return a lost book. Caleb turned back to face her. Because when I read your words, I saw someone fighting for something that mattered. And I've spent the last 3 years not fighting for anything at all. I guess I wanted to know what it felt like to stand for something again. Even if that something was just making sure you got your diary back. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, looking for lies, for hidden motives, for any sign that he was like the other men who'd tried to control her life. You're either the kindest man I've ever met, or the most dangerous, she said finally. I'm neither. I'm just someone who read your story and thought you deserved a better ending than the one they're trying to write for you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Finally, Eleanor nodded slowly. River Street boarding house. For 2 days. Yes, ma'am. I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking for promises. She clutched the diary tighter. Thank you for bringing this back, even though you shouldn't have read it. I know, I'm sorry. Caleb left before she could say anything else, before the moment could crack under the weight of all the things neither of them knew how to say. He walked back to his boarding house through streets that felt different now, lighter somehow, even though he had $5 to his name and no prospects and no plan beyond the next 48 hours. He'd done what he came to do. He'd returned the diary. He'd warned Eleanor about the danger. Now it was up to her what happened next. That night, Caleb lay in his rented bed and stared at the ceiling, trying not to think about Eleanor Hayes' tear-stained face or the way her hands had trembled when she'd taken back the diary, trying not to hope that she'd come find him. The next day passed slowly. Caleb spent it looking for work, anything that might earn him enough to extend his stay in St. Louis, or at least buy a ticket somewhere else. He found nothing. The panic of 1884 was still rippling through the economy, and jobs were scarce for men with no connections and no references. By evening, he'd resigned himself to leaving the city in the morning. He'd tried. He'd done what he could. Now he had to accept that Eleanor Hayes' story would continue without him. He was packing his few belongings when someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find Eleanor standing in the hallway, still wearing her ink-stained dress from the print shop, her hair coming loose from its bun. "May I come in?" she asked. Caleb stepped aside. "Of course." She entered slowly, taking in the small room with its single chair and narrow bed. She stayed near the door as if she might need to run. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "It's not proper." "Proper left town about the same time Common Sense did," Caleb said. "You're safe here. I promise." Eleanor nodded but didn't relax. I've been thinking about what you said, about my father and Mr. Groves being close. And? And I think you're right. There was a man watching the boarding house where I'm staying. I saw him yesterday and again this morning. He left before I could get a good look at him, but she trailed off, hugging herself. You're scared. Of course I'm scared. They're not going to stop. They're going to keep looking until they find me, and when they do, they're going to drag me back to Lexington and force me to marry a man I despise. Her voice broke. And there's nothing I can do about it. There's always something you can do. Like what? Keep running? Keep changing my name and moving from city to city until I run out of money or strength or hope? She shook her head. I can't live like that. Then don't run. Stand your ground. Eleanor laughed without humor. How? I'm a woman with no family support and no legal standing. The law is on their side. Society is on their side. Everything is on their side. Not everything, Caleb said quietly. I'm on your side. She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Why? You don't even know me. I know enough. You know what I wrote in a diary. That's not the same as knowing me. Then tell me something I don't know. Tell me something true. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm tired. I'm so tired of being afraid. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder. I'm tired of lying about who I am. I'm tired of pretending to be brave when all I want to do is curl up in a corner and cry until there's nothing left. Caleb's chest ached. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you human. It makes me a coward. No, Caleb said firmly. A coward would have stayed in Lexington and married Groves and spent the rest of her life regretting it. You left. You fought. You're still fighting. That's not cowardice. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. I don't feel like I'm fighting. I feel like I'm drowning. Then let me help you. How? Caleb didn't have an answer. He had no money, no connections, no power to protect her from men who had all three. All he had was a stubborn refusal to walk away and a growing certainty that Eleanor Hayes mattered more than anything he'd encountered in years. I don't know yet, he admitted, but we'll figure it out. Eleanor wiped her eyes. You keep saying we like this is your problem too. Maybe I need it to be. She studied him for a long moment, and Caleb saw the exact moment when something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. The willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. The print shop is hiring a delivery driver, she said quietly. The foreman mentioned it today. It doesn't pay much, but it's steady work. I'll take it. You don't even know what it pays. Doesn't matter, Eleanor almost smiled. You're either very foolish or very stubborn, Mr. Turner. Can't I be both? This time she did smile, just barely. I suppose you can. She moved toward the door, then stopped. I read the last entry I wrote, the one from the train. I said I didn't have a plan. I remember. I still don't. But maybe, she hesitated. Maybe I don't have to figure it out alone. You don't, Caleb said. Not anymore. Eleanor nodded slowly, then left without another word. Caleb stood in the empty room, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall, and felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like purpose, like direction. Like finally, after 3 years of drifting, he'd found a place to stand. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if Eleanor would trust him, or if they could actually outsmart Groves and her father, or if any of this would work. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let Eleanor Hayes face her future alone. The job at Morrison & Sons paid $12 a week, which wasn't much, but was enough to keep Caleb fed and sheltered while he figured out what came next. The work was simple, loading printed materials onto a wagon and delivering them to businesses across St. Louis. The foreman, a man named Dutch, who'd lost 2 fingers to a printing press years ago, gave Caleb exactly one piece of advice on his first day. Don't be late, don't be drunk, and don't lose any packages. Do that, and we'll get along fine. Caleb did all 3, and they got along fine. What Dutch didn't know, what nobody at Morrison & Sons knew except Eleanor, was that Caleb spent his lunch breaks and evenings helping her plan her next move. They met in public places, always careful, always watching for anyone who might be watching them. A cafe near the riverfront, a park bench under an oak tree, the public library where Eleanor could pretend to research something while they talked in whispers between the stacks. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor told him one evening as they sat on a bench overlooking the Mississippi. The sun was setting, painting the water gold and orange. "About standing my ground instead of running. And I don't know how to do that. The law says I'm my father's property until I marry, at which point I become my husband's property. There's no legal ground for me to stand on." Caleb watched a steamboat churn past, its paddle wheel throwing up white water. "What if you weren't Eleanor Hayes anymore?" She turned to look at him. "I've tried that. I've been Ellen White for 2 weeks now, and before that I was Eleanor Whitfield for almost 2 months. False names don't change who I am or what they can do to me." "I'm not talking about a false name," Caleb said carefully. "I'm talking about becoming someone else legally, someone they can't touch." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. "You're suggesting marriage." "I'm suggesting a solution. Marriage to a stranger is not a solution, Mr. Turner. It's just trading one cage for another." "Not if it's done right." Caleb turned to face her fully. "Listen to me. If you marry me, you're no longer under your father's control. You're legally independent, and I promise you, I swear to you, I won't try to control your life. You want to teach? You teach. You want to live separately? We live separately. You want an annulment after a year? We get an annulment. But in the meantime, you're protected." Eleanor stared at him like he'd suggested they rob a bank together. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You don't even know me." "I know enough." "You know what you read in a diary." Her voice was rising, drawing looks from other people in the park. She lowered it to a harsh whisper. "That doesn't mean you know who I am. It doesn't mean we're compatible. It doesn't mean this wouldn't be a disaster." "You're right," Caleb said calmly. "It might be a disaster, but it also might save your life." Eleanor stood abruptly, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I need to think. Take all the time you need. Don't patronize me. I'm not. I mean it. This is your decision, Eleanor. Not mine, not your father's, not Groves's. Yours." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked away, her skirts swishing against the grass. Caleb stayed on the bench until the sun disappeared and the street lamps began to glow. He'd laid out the offer. Now all he could do was wait. 3 days passed with no word from Eleanor. Caleb saw her at the print shop. She was always there when he came to load the wagon, but she didn't speak to him beyond polite workplace pleasantries. He didn't push. He'd meant what he said about it being her choice. On the 4th day, Dutch called him into the office. "There's 2 men here asking about one of our typesetters," the foreman said, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. "Well-dressed fellows. Said they're looking for a young woman who might be working under a false name. They showed me a photograph." Caleb's blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I don't give out information about my employees. Told them if they had legal business, they could take it up with the police." Dutch's eyes narrowed. "But I got the feeling they're not the type to involve the police. And I got the feeling this has something to do with you and Ellen White." "It might." "She in some kind of trouble?" "She's trying to get out of some kind of trouble." Dutch was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I don't like men who hunt women. Had a sister once who married a man like that. Didn't end well." He pushed off from the desk. "I told those fellows she quit last week. Moved on to Jefferson City. Don't know if they believed me, but it bought you some time." "Thank you," Caleb said, the words feeling inadequate. "Don't thank me yet. They'll be back when they figure out I lied. And when they come back, I won't be able to protect either of you." Dutch moved toward the door, then stopped. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast." Caleb found Eleanor in the typesetting room. She was alone, the other workers having left for lunch. She looked up when he entered, and he saw immediately that she already knew. "They were here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Dutch sent them away, told them you'd left town. They won't believe that for long." "I know." Eleanor set down the composing stick she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep running and hiding and waiting for them to find me." Then don't. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw fear and exhaustion and something else. Something that might have been surrender or might have been resolve. If I marry you, what exactly are you expecting from me? Nothing you don't want to give. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have, Caleb said. I'm not looking for a wife in the traditional sense, Eleanor. I'm offering you a legal shield, a way to stand your ground without standing alone. And what do you get out of it? The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on helping her that he hadn't thought about what he wanted from this arrangement. But standing there looking at Eleanor Hayes, intelligent, fierce, desperate Eleanor Hayes, he realized he did want something. I get to stop drifting, he said quietly. I get to be part of something that matters. Eleanor studied his face like she was trying to read his thoughts. This is insane. Probably. We could both regret this. We could. I don't love you. I don't love you either. That made her smile, just barely. At least we're honest with each other. It's a start. She took a deep breath, then another. If we do this, and I'm not saying we will, but if we do, I have conditions. Name them. I want to keep working. I want to keep saving money. And I want it understood that this is temporary. When I'm safe, when they've given up looking for me, we end this arrangement. Agreed. I want my own space. My own room. Done. And I don't want you telling me how to live my life. Never would. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, looking younger than her 23 years. I'm scared. I know. What if this doesn't work? Then we figure out something else. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she straightened her shoulders in that way Caleb had seen in her writing, that quiet determination that had carried her this far. All right, she said, let's do it. They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony at the courthouse. The judge was a tired-looking man in his 60s who'd clearly performed hundreds of these civil ceremonies and found them all equally tedious. Caleb wore his best shirt, which wasn't saying much. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and she held a small bouquet of wildflowers that Caleb had bought from a street vendor for 30 cents. There were no guests, no family, no celebration. The judge read the vows in a monotone. Caleb and Eleanor repeated them, their voices steady despite the strangeness of the moment. When it came time to exchange rings, Caleb produced 2 simple gold bands he'd bought with the last of his savings. They were thin and plain, but they were real. I now pronounce you man and wife, the judge said, already reaching for the next set of papers on his desk. You may kiss the bride if you want to, but it's not required. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She looked back, her expression carefully neutral. We don't have to, he said quietly. I know. But she leaned forward anyway and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. It lasted less than a second, but Caleb felt it like a brand. They signed the marriage certificate. The judge stamped it with a heavy seal, and just like that, Eleanor Hayes became Eleanor Turner. They walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sunshine. Eleanor looked down at the ring on her finger, turning it slowly. It's done, she said, sounding dazed. It's done. I'm married. So am I. She laughed, a sharp sound that was part disbelief and part relief. This is the strangest thing I've ever done. Same. They stood there on the courthouse steps, 2 strangers who'd just legally bound their lives together, and for a moment neither of them knew what to say. Finally, Eleanor spoke. What happens now? Now we make it convincing, Caleb said. We find a place to live. We act like a married couple, and we wait for your father and Groves to give up. You make it sound simple. It won't be, but we'll manage. They found a small apartment above a tailor's shop on the edge of the city. 2 rooms, a shared kitchen, and a landlady named Mrs. Chen who spoke limited English but understood rent money just fine. The place was barely furnished, but it was clean and the roof didn't leak. They moved in with the few possessions they had between them. Eleanor took the bedroom. Caleb made a bed on the floor in the main room using blankets Mrs. Chen sold him for $2. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. The first week was awkward. They moved around each other like dancers who didn't know the steps, careful not to intrude, careful not to presume. Eleanor left for the print shop before dawn and returned after dark. Caleb worked his delivery route and spent his evenings reading newspapers he found in the trash. They spoke in polite sentences about practical matters: rent, food, whether they needed more lamp oil. They didn't talk about the marriage. They didn't talk about what would happen next. They existed in a strange limbo where they were legally bound but emotionally separate. Then, 2 weeks after the wedding, everything changed. Caleb was loading the wagon outside Morrison and Sons when a familiar voice called his name. Caleb Turner. He turned to find Thornton Groves standing 10 feet away, flanked by another man Caleb didn't recognize. Groves was exactly as Eleanor had described in her diary: well-dressed, confident, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. "Can I help you?" Caleb asked, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm looking for a young woman," Groves said. "Eleanor Hayes. I have reason to believe you know where she is." "Never heard of her." "Don't lie to me, boy." Groves stepped closer. "We've been tracking her for weeks. We know she was in Kansas City, we know she came to St. Louis, and we know you've been following her trail like a lovesick puppy." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The hotel clerk in Kansas City remembered you. So did the employment agent. So did half a dozen other people you interrogated about Eleanor's whereabouts." Groves smiled, and it was the smile of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Where is she?" "I told you, I don't know anyone named Eleanor Hayes." The man beside Groves moved forward. He was younger, bigger, with scarred knuckles that suggested he settled disputes with his fists. "Maybe we should help him remember." "That won't be necessary," Groves said mildly. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to Caleb. "This is a warrant for Eleanor's arrest. She stole money from her family. She's also been deemed mentally unfit and in need of protective custody. When we find her, and we will find her, she'll be returned to Lexington to face justice." Caleb looked at the warrant. It was official looking, complete with a judge's signature and a county seal. It was also completely fabricated. Eleanor had stolen nothing, and she was as sane as anyone. But the paper didn't care about truth. It only cared about what could be proven. "Like I said," Caleb repeated slowly, "I don't know anyone by that name." Groves studied him for a long moment. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be my first." "We can make things very difficult for you, Mr. Turner." "You can try." The bigger man took another step forward, but Groves held up a hand. "Not here. Too many witnesses." He pocketed the warrant. "But this isn't over. When we find Eleanor, and we will, I'll make sure she knows you could have helped her, and chose not to." They left, and Caleb stood there with his heart hammering and his hands clenched into fists. That evening, he told Eleanor everything. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each word. "They have a warrant," she said when he finished. "A judge signed it. A judge they paid to sign it. It's not real." "It's real enough to get me arrested." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. She flinched, then allowed it. "They can't touch you. You're Eleanor Turner now. That warrant is for Eleanor Hayes. They'll figure it out. Not if we're careful. Not if we make this convincing." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. "How do we make it convincing? We live like we're actually married. We're seen together in public. We let people know we're a couple. And if Groves comes back, we show him that marriage certificate and dare him to do something about it." "He might." "He might," Caleb agreed. "But right now it's the best protection we have." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she squeezed his hand once, briefly, before pulling away. "All right, we'll try it your way." The next day they started making their marriage public. They walked to work together, Caleb's hand resting lightly on Eleanor's elbow in the way married couples did. They ate lunch at a cafe where other Morrison and Sons employees could see them. They attended a church service on Sunday, sitting in the pew together with Eleanor's hand in Caleb's. It felt like acting at first, like they were playing roles in someone else's story. But gradually, something shifted. The pretense started to feel less like pretense and more like practice for something real. They began talking in the evenings, real conversations that went beyond practical matters. Eleanor told him about her childhood in Lexington, about her mother who'd wanted more for her daughters than she'd had for herself but lacked the courage to fight for it. Caleb told her about Wyoming, about the ranch that had been his whole world until it wasn't, about his father's debts and his own failure to hold on to anything permanent. "Why did you really follow me?" Eleanor asked one night as they sat at the small table, a single lamp burning between them. "And don't say it was just to return the diary. I need to know the truth." Caleb thought about lying, about giving her some noble answer that would make him sound better than he was. But Eleanor deserved honesty. "Because I was drifting," he said. "I've been drifting for 3 years, just going through the motions of being alive without actually living. And then I read your words, and I saw someone fighting for something real. I wanted to be part of that fight. I wanted to matter to someone's story, even if it was just as the person who gave you back your diary." Eleanor's eyes were soft in the lamplight. "You matter to more than just my story now." "Do I?" "Yes." She said it simply, without elaboration, but the words settled into Caleb's chest like warmth. A month passed, then 2. Groves didn't return, but Caleb knew he was still out there, still looking. They saw his man, the big one with the scarred knuckles, watching the print shop from across the street one afternoon. Eleanor froze when she spotted him, but Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders and kissed her temple like any husband would. The man watched them for a few minutes, then left. "They're trying to rattle us," Caleb said. "It's working. Don't let it. We're doing everything right." But Eleanor was right to be afraid. 3 days later, Groves showed up at their apartment. Mrs. Chen knocked on their door just after dinner, her face worried. "2 men downstairs. They say they know you. They want to talk." Caleb and Eleanor exchanged a look. Then Caleb stood. "I'll handle it." "No," Eleanor said, rising as well. "We handle it together." They went downstairs to find Groves and his associate waiting in the building's small entryway. Groves's expression was cold fury barely contained. "Eleanor," he said, ignoring Caleb entirely. "It's time to stop this foolishness and come home." "I am home," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear Caleb could feel radiating from her. "This isn't home. This is a squalid apartment in a city that's eating you alive. Come back to Lexington. Your family misses you. I'm willing to forgive this entire incident if you return with me now." "I'm not coming back." "You don't have a choice." "Yes, I do." Eleanor lifted her left hand, showing the gold band. "I'm married, Mr. Groves. Whatever claim you think you had on me is gone." Groves's face went white, then red. "Married to who? This drifter?" He spat the word like it was poison. "I'll have it annulled. I'll have it declared invalid. You'll do nothing," Caleb interrupted. "Eleanor is my wife. We were married legally in this city by a judge. There's documentation. There are witnesses. And unless you have legal grounds to challenge it, I suggest you leave." "Legal grounds?" Groves pulled out the warrant again. "I have legal grounds to have her arrested." "That warrant is for Eleanor Hayes," Caleb said. "This is Eleanor Turner. Different person. Different legal status." Groves's hand crumpled the paper. "You think you're clever. You think you've won. But you've just made things worse for her. When I prove this marriage is a sham, and I will prove it, she'll face charges for fraud in addition to everything else." "Prove it then?" Eleanor said, stepping forward. Her voice was shaking, but she didn't back down. "Prove I don't love my husband. Prove this marriage isn't real. Prove I'm the person you claim I am. Go ahead." Groves stared at her, and for the first time, Caleb saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "Your father is heartbroken," Groves said, changing tactics. "Your mother cries herself to sleep every night. You're tearing your family apart." "My family tried to tear me apart first," Eleanor said. "Now please leave. You're not welcome here." Groves looked at Caleb. "She'll regret this. When you can't provide for her, when you abandon her like every other worthless drifter, she'll regret choosing you over security." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but it'll be her regret to have, not yours." Groves and his associate left, but Caleb knew it wasn't over. Men like Groves didn't give up easily. That night, Eleanor couldn't stop shaking. Caleb made her tea and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and they sat together in the lamplight until her trembling subsided. "He's not going to stop," she whispered. "I know. What do we do?" Caleb took her hand. We keep going. We keep building this life. And eventually he'll realize he's lost and he'll move on. You really believe that? I have to. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, and Caleb felt the full weight of what they'd taken on. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about building something real out of something that had started as pretense. It was about becoming the people they'd promised to be. Winter came to St. Louis with a vengeance that year, turning the Mississippi into a sheet of gray ice and the streets into frozen rivers of mud. Caleb worked through it all, delivering packages in weather that made his fingers go numb inside his gloves and his breath hang in the air like smoke. Eleanor kept her position at Morrison & Sons, her hands stained perpetually with ink, her eyes tired but determined. They fell into a rhythm. Caleb would wake first, starting a fire in the small stove to warm the apartment before Eleanor rose. She would make coffee while he dressed for work, and they would eat breakfast together in companionable silence. In the evenings, they would sit at their small table and talk about their days, about the difficult customers and the broken printing presses, and the foreman who'd finally learned to pronounce Eleanor's name correctly. It was ordinary, it was simple, and somewhere in the midst of those ordinary, simple days, something extraordinary happened. They became real. The shift was so gradual that Caleb couldn't pinpoint exactly when it occurred. Maybe it was the night Eleanor laughed at one of his stories about a delivery gone wrong, a genuine laugh that lit up her whole face. Maybe it was the morning he woke to find she'd mended his torn shirt without being asked. Maybe it was the dozens of small moments in between, the conversations that stretched past midnight, the way she'd started touching his arm when she wanted his attention, the fact that he'd stopped sleeping on the floor and started using the small sofa she'd insisted they buy from a second-hand shop. Or maybe it was the day Eleanor got her teaching position. It happened in early March, when the ice was finally beginning to thaw, and the first hints of spring were creeping into the air. Eleanor came home from the print shop with her eyes shining and her hands trembling. "I got a letter," she said, before Caleb had even closed the door. "From the Riverside School." Caleb set down his pack. "And?" "They want to interview me for a teaching position starting in the fall term." She pressed the letter against her chest. "A real position, with a real salary." "Eleanor, that's wonderful." "I know. I can hardly believe it." Then her expression clouded. "But what if they find out about Lexington? What if someone contacts my father?" "They won't. You're Eleanor Turner now. You have references from Morrison & Sons. You have a husband who can vouch for your character." Caleb crossed to her and took her hands. "This is what you've been fighting for. Don't let fear steal it from you now." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Come with me." "To the interview?" "To all of it. The interview, the position, if I get it, everything. Come with me." Caleb's heart kicked. "Eleanor, you don't need me there. You're strong enough to do this on your own." "I know I am, but I don't want to." She tightened her grip on his hands. "I'm tired of doing everything alone. I'm tired of pretending this marriage is just a legal arrangement. I'm tired of acting like I don't care about you when I do." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "You care about me?" Caleb asked quietly. "Of course I do, you fool. You followed me across 2 states. You married me to keep me safe. You've spent the last 4 months pretending to be my husband when you could have walked away at any time. How could I not care about you?" "I wasn't pretending," Caleb said. "Not for a long time now." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between returning your diary and right now, this stopped being about helping a stranger and started being about—" He paused, searching for the right words. "About building a life with someone who matters to me." "I matter to you?" More than I knew how to say. Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him. Not a quick, chaste kiss like the one at their courthouse wedding, but a real kiss that tasted like coffee and hope and all the things they'd been too afraid to acknowledge until now. When they broke apart, Eleanor was crying. Happy tears, Caleb realized, the kind that came from relief and joy mixed together. "So you'll come with me?" she asked. "To the interview and wherever comes after." "I'll come with you anywhere." The interview was set for the following week. Eleanor spent the intervening days preparing, practicing her answers, rereading the letter until she had it memorized. Caleb helped her buy a new dress for the occasion, nothing fancy, but respectable and neat. She wore it the morning of the interview with her hair carefully pinned and her hands folded to hide their trembling. The Riverside School was housed in a converted church building on the western edge of the city. 3 members of the school board sat behind a table in what had once been the vestry, examining Eleanor with careful attention. Caleb waited outside, pacing the hallway and trying not to listen at the door. When Eleanor finally emerged 45 minutes later, her face was unreadable. "How did it go?" Caleb asked. "I don't know. They asked about my experience, my methods, my philosophy on education. I answered as best I could." She looked down at her hands. "One of them asked why I wanted to teach." "What did you say?" "I told them the truth, that I wanted something that belonged to me, that I wanted to make a difference in children's lives the way my teachers made a difference in mine, that I believed education was the key to freedom." She looked up at Caleb. "Do you think that was the right answer?" "I think it was an honest answer. That counts for something." They walked home through streets beginning to smell of mud and growing things. Eleanor was quiet, lost in thought. Caleb didn't push her to talk. He just walked beside her, his presence a steady comfort. The letter arrived a week later. Eleanor opened it with shaking hands while Caleb watched from across the table. She read it once, then again, then a third time before she finally looked up. "I got the position." Caleb felt relief flood through him. "Eleanor, that's incredible. $60 for the term, plus access to the schoolhouse library." She set the letter down carefully, as if it might disappear if handled too roughly. "I did it. I'm actually going to be a teacher." "You were always going to be a teacher. The school board just finally caught up to what I've known all along." Eleanor stood and walked around the table to where Caleb sat. She took his face in her hands and kissed him deeply, thoroughly, with the kind of passion that came from months of restraint finally breaking free. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips, "for believing in me when no one else would." "Always," Caleb promised. But their joy was short-lived. 2 days after Eleanor received the letter, Thornton Groves made his final play. Caleb was walking home from work when a hand grabbed his arm and yanked him into an alley. Before he could react, 2 men had him pinned against the wall. Groves stepped out of the shadows, his expensive suit looking out of place in the grimy alley. "Mr. Turner," Groves said pleasantly, "we need to have a conversation." "Don't have anything to say to you," Caleb ground out, struggling against the men holding him. "Then you can listen." Groves pulled out a folder and opened it. "I've done some investigating into your background. Interesting reading. You're the son of Robert Turner, formerly of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Your father died 3 years ago, leaving you with debts you couldn't pay. You lost the family ranch and have been drifting ever since, working odd jobs and barely staying ahead of poverty." He looked up with a cold smile. "Not exactly the stable husband Eleanor deserves, is it?" "Eleanor chose me. That's all that matters." "Eleanor chose a fantasy. She chose a man who convinced her he could protect her, when in reality you can barely protect yourself." Groves pulled out another paper. "This is an annulment petition. All you have to do is sign it, testify that the marriage was never consummated, and walk away with $500. Enough to start over somewhere else. Enough to finally stop drifting." Caleb stared at the paper. $500 was more money than he'd ever seen in one place. It was security. It was possibility. It was everything he'd been chasing for 3 years. It was also a betrayal of everything that mattered. "No," Caleb said. Groves's smile faded. "I'm offering you a way out. A generous way out. Take it." "No." "You're being foolish. Eleanor will realize her mistake eventually. When she does, she'll leave you anyway. Why not save yourself the pain and take the money now?" "Because I love her," Caleb said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "And she loves me. And no amount of money is worth losing that." Groves's face twisted with rage. He nodded to the men holding Caleb. "Teach him a lesson about refusing good offers." The first punch caught Caleb in the stomach, doubling him over. The second caught his jaw, snapping his head back. They worked him over methodically, professionally, and when they finally let him drop to the muddy ground, Groves crouched beside him. "This was your last chance," Groves said. "The next time we meet, I won't be offering money. I'll be taking what's mine." They left Caleb bleeding in the alley. He made it home somehow, stumbling through streets that seemed to tilt and sway. Eleanor took one look at him and went pale. "Who did this?" she demanded, helping him to a chair. "Groves. That bastard. I'm calling the police. Won't do any good. It's his word against mine, and he's got money to make problems disappear." Eleanor cleaned his wounds with hands that shook with fury. "He's not going to stop. You were right. He'll never stop until he gets what he wants. Then we give him something he doesn't want." "What?" Caleb winced as Eleanor dabbed at a cut above his eye. "We leave St. Louis. We go somewhere he can't find us. Somewhere we can actually build a life without looking over our shoulders." "Where?" "I don't know yet, but anywhere's better than here." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on his face. "The teaching position. It's here in St. Louis." "I know. If we leave, I lose it." "I know that too." She pulled her hands away and stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "I fought so hard for this. I've sacrificed everything for the chance to teach, and now you're asking me to give it up." "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I think we need to do to stay safe. But the decision is yours, Eleanor. It's always been yours." Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the street below. The lamplight caught her profile, highlighting the exhaustion and determination that lived in equal measure on her face. "I read my diary last night," she said quietly, "the old entries from before I left Lexington. Do you know what strikes me most reading them now?" "What?" "How small my dreams were. I thought freedom meant teaching. I thought independence meant earning my own money. But I was wrong." She turned to face him. "Freedom isn't about what you do. It's about who you choose to do it with. And I choose you, Caleb Turner. I choose you over teaching, over St. Louis, over everything." Caleb stood, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "You don't have to choose. We'll find another way." "There is no other way. Not here. Not with Groves hunting us." She crossed to him and took his battered hands in hers. "So we leave. We go somewhere new, and we build the life we want instead of the life everyone else wants for us." "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They left St. Louis 2 weeks later on a train heading west. Not back to Wyoming, where Caleb's past still haunted him, but to Colorado, to a territory that was still writing its own story, where two people with nothing but each other could carve out a place to belong. They settled in a small town called Ridgeway, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. It was beautiful and remote and exactly what they needed. Caleb found work at a ranch 20 miles outside of town, breaking horses for a man who cared more about skill than about where he'd come from. The work was hard but honest, and the rancher paid fair wages. Eleanor took a position at the local schoolhouse. It wasn't the Riverside School with its impressive library and formal board. It was a one-room building that served children from ranches scattered across 50 square miles. But it was hers. The children called her Mrs. Turner and brought her wildflowers and learned their letters under her patient guidance. In the evenings, Caleb and Eleanor would sit on the porch of the small house they rented and watch the sun set behind the mountains. They would talk about their days, about the stubborn horse Caleb was training, and the student who'd finally learned to read, and sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence. One evening, nearly a year after they'd arrived in Ridgeway, Eleanor pulled out her old diary. "I haven't written in this since we got married," she said, running her fingers over the worn leather. "I think it's time to finish the story." She opened to a blank page and began to write. Caleb watched her, the lamplight catching the gold of her wedding ring as her hand moved across the page. When she finished, she showed him what she'd written. June 1888, Colorado. "I have learned something important these past months. I have learned that the life you plan is never the life you get, and that's not always a bad thing. I plan to be a teacher in Missouri. Instead, I am a teacher in Colorado, married to a man I met because I was careless enough to leave my diary on a train. I plan to be independent and alone. Instead, I am independent and loved, which is infinitely better. I planned to run from my past until I was safe. Instead, I found someone who helped me stand still long enough to build a future. His name is Caleb Turner. He is stubborn and kind, and he believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. He is my husband in every sense of the word now, not just on paper, and I cannot imagine my life without him. I thought freedom meant doing everything alone. I was wrong. Freedom means choosing who stands beside you, and I choose him. Every day, I choose him. Caleb read it twice, his throat tight with emotion. You're giving me too much credit. I'm giving you exactly the credit you deserve. Eleanor closed the diary and set it aside. That book brought us together, but this is what keeps us together. She placed his hand over her stomach, and Caleb felt his breath catch. Eleanor? I'm pregnant, she said, smiling even as tears filled her eyes. We're going to have a baby. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. Are you scared? Terrified. Me too. But we'll figure it out? We always do. Their daughter was born the following spring, tiny and perfect and loud. They named her Catherine after Eleanor's aunt who'd given her the diary. Caleb held her in the hours after the birth, marveling at the weight of her, at the trust in her sleeping face, at the responsibility of raising a person who would carry their story forward. She's going to have a better life than I did, Eleanor whispered from the bed, exhausted but glowing. She's going to grow up knowing she can choose her own path. Yes, she will, Caleb promised. 2 years later, they had a son, then another daughter. The small house became crowded with children and noise and life. Caleb saved every penny he could, and eventually he bought a piece of land outside Ridgeway. He built a stable and corrals, and slowly, carefully, he established himself as a horse trainer. People came from all over the territory to have their horses trained by Caleb Turner, the quiet man who understood animals better than most people understood themselves. Eleanor continued teaching until the children were old enough that staying home became more practical, but she never stopped educating. She taught her own children to read before they could walk, filled their house with books, and encouraged every question no matter how difficult. Years passed. The children grew. The diary gathered dust on a shelf in their bedroom, a relic of a time that felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Then one evening, when Catherine was 16 and asking questions about how her parents had met, Eleanor took down the diary and handed it to her daughter. "Read this," she said, "and then we'll talk." Catherine read it over the course of 3 days, her eyes growing wider with each page. When she finished, she looked at her mother with something like awe. "You were so brave," Catherine said. "I was desperate," Eleanor corrected. "Bravery came later." "And Papa found you because of this?" "Your father found me because he was stubborn and kind and couldn't stand the thought of someone being alone when they didn't have to be." Catherine looked at Caleb, who was sitting in his chair by the fire, mending a bridle. "Is that true, Papa?" Caleb looked up and met Eleanor's eyes across the room. "Something like that." "Tell me the rest," Catherine said. "The diary ends when Mama got on the train to St. Louis. What happened after?" So they told her. They told her about the confrontation in the print shop, about the courthouse wedding, about Thornton Groves and the beating in the alley. They told her about the decision to leave St. Louis, about the journey to Colorado, about the years of building something real out of something that had started as pure necessity. They told her the truth, and Catherine listened with the kind of attention that suggested she understood the weight of what she was hearing. "So this diary," Catherine said, holding it carefully, "saved both of you." "In a way," Eleanor agreed, "but it was your father who did the saving. The diary just brought us together." "Can I keep it?" Catherine asked. "Not forever, but I'd like to copy some of it, for my own children someday, so they know where they come from." Eleanor looked at Caleb. He nodded. "Of course you can keep it," Eleanor said. "It's part of your story too." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Caleb and Eleanor sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge over the mountains. They'd done this hundreds of times, but it never got old. The silence between them was comfortable, layered with years of trust and understanding. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "The way things turned out?" "Not for a second." "You?" "Never." She took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after years of practice. "I thought I was running toward independence. Turns out I was running toward you." "Lucky for me you left that diary on the train." Eleanor laughed. "Lucky for both of us." They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Eleanor spoke again. Caleb? Hmm? Thank you. For what? For seeing me when I felt invisible, for standing beside me when you could have walked away, for giving me a life I never imagined I could have. Caleb raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. You gave me the same thing. We saved each other, Eleanor. That's how this works. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they watched the stars together until the cold drove them inside. The years continued to pass. The children grew up and moved on to build their own lives. Catherine became a teacher like her mother, carrying the diary with her as a reminder of what courage looked like. The boys worked with their father, learning the patient art of training horses and building trust. Caleb's hair turned gray, then white. Eleanor's hands grew spotted with age. They moved slower, spoke softer, but the bond between them never weakened. If anything, it grew stronger, deepened by decades of choosing each other every single day. When Caleb was 73, he finally told Eleanor something he'd been thinking about for years. I need to tell you something, he said one evening as they sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. What's that? When I found your diary, I was planning to go to Kansas City and take a job that probably didn't exist. I was drifting, just like I'd been drifting for years. And if I hadn't picked up that diary, I would have kept drifting until I drifted right out of existence. Eleanor waited, knowing there was more. You saved my life, Eleanor, not in some dramatic way, but in the way that matters most. You gave me a reason to stop moving and start living. You gave me a purpose, a home, a family. His voice cracked. You gave me everything. Eleanor took his weathered hand in hers. You gave me the same, you stubborn man. Don't you see? We saved each other. I love you, Caleb said. I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I know how to express. I know. And I love you too. Always have, from the moment you showed up at that print shop with my diary and that ridiculous earnest expression on your face. They sat together until the sun set and the stars came out, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a life that neither of them could have imagined. The diary remained in the family for generations. It was passed from Catherine to her daughter, from granddaughter to great-granddaughter, each woman reading the words Eleanor had written so long ago and understanding that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and moving forward anyway. It was about making choices that defined your life instead of letting your life be defined by other people's choices. It was about finding someone who saw you, really saw you, and chose to stand beside you anyway. And it was about understanding that the best stories weren't the ones you planned. They were the ones that found you when you were brave enough to leave something behind on a train and trust that the right person would pick it up. Years after both Caleb and Eleanor had passed, their great-granddaughter opened the diary one last time. She found a final entry, written in Eleanor's shaky handwriting from her final years. This diary began as a record of fear and escape. It became a witness to love and partnership. Let it serve as a reminder to anyone who reads it. Sometimes the greatest adventure is not running away, but choosing to stand still with someone who makes standing still feel like coming home. My name is Eleanor Turner. I was once Eleanor Hayes, a girl who didn't know her own strength. I became Eleanor Whitfield, a woman learning to fight for herself. And finally, I became Eleanor Turner, a woman who learned that true freedom isn't about being alone. It's about being seen, being loved, and having the courage to see and love in return. If you're reading this and you're afraid, know that fear is not weakness. Fear is proof that you care about something enough to protect it. And if you're reading this and you're alone, know that the right person is out there. Maybe they're picking up something you left behind. Maybe they're following your trail through cities you'll never visit again. Maybe they're waiting for you to trust them enough to stop running. My husband once told me that some secrets aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be found. I'm grateful mine was found by him. The diary was closed and carefully stored away, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages yellowed but intact. It had started as one woman's private rebellion and become a family's greatest treasure. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, in a small cemetery where wildflowers grew thick in the summer, two headstones stood side by side. The inscriptions were simple. Caleb Turner, beloved husband, father, and friend. He chose to stand still. Eleanor Turner, beloved wife, mother, and teacher. She chose to be free. Between the stones, someone had planted forget-me-nots. They bloomed every spring without fail, blue as the sky on the day two strangers became partners, as endless as the love that had grown from a diary left on a train and a cowboy stubborn enough to return it. Some stories end with grand gestures. This one ended the way the best stories do, with two people who found each other, chose each other, and built a life that mattered. The diary had brought them together, but love, respect, and the courage to keep choosing each other had made them family. And that was everything.